Hello, everyone. Sorry, I am late. I sat in traffic for a whole hour, just not moving, just not even moving. I think I'm going to change these Friday streams till 6 o'clock because trying to get here at 5:45 on a Friday, the traffic is terrible Fridays. I don't know where everyone's going. I don't know where everyone is going, but it is what it is. Can everyone hear me okay? Just want to double check the audio. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? I don't know what's going on with Rockfin. I can't go live on Rockfin for some reason. I don't know. Rockfin is weird sometimes. It's very strange. Oh, I think I know. Let me hit edit. This thing is so I don't know why Rockfin does this. We go to okay. Think I had to change the time on here again too. All right. Now, let me go live. Any day now, Rockfin. Sorry guys, Rockfin has a delay. I don't know what's going on, but it's not letting me click the go live button. So who knows? It should do that and it's not. I guess I'll just have to come back and delete that. That is really weird. Like that shouldn't even be an issue. All right, anyway. Let me do this really quick. Man, I'm glad it's Friday. All right, I'm giving up on Rockfin. Sorry. Alrighty. So we are discussing standardized tests. Now, this is a big one for me because a lot of you know I work in education and I have had issues with standardized testing for quite some time. And I wanted to do a show about this because I want people to understand how these tests are manipulated, how they are skewed, and how they are not written to help Black people actually perform well on these exams. I have a couple of video clips I do want to show you. Give me just a second. I'm going to pull those up. So, the standardized tests that I'm going to be talking about are the SATs, which I know a lot of you are familiar with. There's a short segment on the LSATs, which is the exam that people take to get into law school. Um, and there's a short segment about charter schools as well and how we are heading in that direction, and that is just not a good way to go. So give me just a second. I'm opening up my email now and let me pull up that clip. Now this one, I'm going to play this one called Why Standardized Testing is Racist. Now I'm going to go ahead and give you a heads up because I don't like to, throw people curveballs. But Jamal Bowman is in this video, you guys. And let's just remember he was an educator before he was a congressman. So that is what he's going to be referencing in this video. It's not political, it's strictly about standardized testing in education. So here we go. Let me go ahead and share my screen. I agree, Eric. Charter schools shouldn't exist, period. I agree 100%. It's a problem. We're going to get into that in just a second. But let me go ahead and share my screen because I want you to hear this video. What? Hold on. Okay. Man, I'm glad it's Friday. All righty, ladies and gentlemen, here we go. Share my screen. Why standardized testing is racist. Let me mute my mic.
Well, kids are going to do on I can predict for you how well kids are going to do on a test by and large. Lower income kids are going to do worse. Children of color are going to do worse. Children with special needs are going to do worse. English language learners are going to do worse, because if you're of a certain class, of a certain community, if your parents are well educated, you're more likely to do better on the test. Standardized tests are created by third-party vendors, not teachers, not educators. Third-party vendors who sell these tests to states. So it's a whole industry aligned to these standardized tests that, by the way, we've been implementing for 20 years, and the achievement gap has not closed at all.
I understand taking tests aren't fun. Too bad. We need to know in America. We need to know whether or not children have got the basic education.
When No Child Left Behind came, followed by Race to the Top, followed by ESSA, there was a lot of money invested in this industry and in the test prep industry as well. So you have these test prep industries that have grown 400% since No Child Left Behind. You have these third-party vendors creating these tests for school districts and states are forced to implement them. So it made a lot of people a lot of money. But then the charter school industry is also part of that money train as well, because the tests have been weaponized against teachers and schools and teachers' unions.
For too long, countless American children have been trapped in failing government schools.
And the more you say a teacher is bad and the public school is bad, the more momentum you have to close that school. And when schools close, charter schools open.
A little more than a decade ago, only about 300,000 students were enrolled in charter schools nationwide. As their growth has soared, especially in cities, nearly 2 million students are now enrolled.
And though many of them are considered not for profit, they have privately elected school boards. They have a lot of private funding that's coming in. And through the federal new market tax credit, within 7 years of your investment in charter schools, you can double your money.
$500,000 for each Success Academy school, most of it from wealthy investors on Wall Street.
It is the hedge fund industry. It's a privatization movement, unregulated.
Research shows us that more testing doesn't close gaps. It's a focus on early childhood education, formative assessment, teacher training and development, and project-based learning that does. This directly aligns to New Deal policy, because the New Deal redlined communities and starved them of resources. I used to work at a school where we had no windows in classrooms. And that's where you see the low test scores, in redline communities, right? So when we talk about a new deal for public schools, getting rid of standardized tests and the way we implement them, it's about reimagining and redesigning all of it in alignment with racial justice.
All right, so let's talk about that for a minute. One of the things that I want to point out about standardized testing, and this is something that I've seen from my own experience, from my friends' experience, and from students' experience as well. One of the problems with standardized testing are the questions that they ask on the test. What do I mean by that? Best example I can give is the SATs. So when I took the SATs, they had a written portion that was like the writing, English, reading portion, and they had the math section as well. One of the things that was really interesting to me is, remember when you had to read those long essays and then you had to answer a couple of questions about the essays? When I read those essays, the situations that were described, the stories that were told in those essays, was not something that I could relate to. And this is a common problem. A lot of times we're reading these passages that are about Eurocentric culture. We're reading these passages that are about things that have happened like in medieval times, things that none of us can relate to, like the medieval era, because we weren't back during then. But then you get to the point where they talk about culture that is not our own. So the examples that they give usually apply to Eurocentric culture. That's one of the problems. So if you can't relate to the story that they're asking you to read, the passage they're asking you to read, you may have a difficult time answering the questions about that passage. Another thing that they tend to do on these tests, the language that they use. They tend to use vocabulary, especially with the SATs. They'll use vocabulary that a lot of us, especially for Black people, we may not even be familiar with. But we have to, this is kind of where code switching comes in. It's like we have to code switch to identify with the stories, the essays on those exams that we are told to read. That in itself is also problematic. Now, why is that a problem? Because if you have to switch it in your mind to try to figure out what they're really talking about, that takes time to do. And all of these exams are timed. What that means, it does not mean that you are not as smart as your peers. But what it does mean is that it may take you longer to answer that one question than it may take your white classmate from the suburbs. And that's a problem when these exams are timed because you have to move quickly. Now, in reference to timed exams, there's a clip I want to play for you by Malcolm Gladwell. And if you guys are not familiar with Malcolm Gladwell, familiarize yourself with him. He has a book called The Tipping Point. I highly recommend that you read it if you haven't, because he talks about how, for one of the examples he gives is the city of Baltimore, and he talks about how Baltimore changed when the jobs were taken away, factory jobs closed, that was gone. Drugs were brought into the city, and how once drugs were brought in, that was the tipping point, and that led to the AIDS epidemic. So that's a whole nother topic I can get into. But Malcolm Gladwell, in this video that I'm about to show you, he brings up the problem with standardized tests being timed. Let me go ahead and pull up this clip. So this is in reference to the LSAT exams. The LSAT exams are for those who want to go to law school. So yes, you have to take an exam even for that. And it is timed. And I have looked at LSAT practice books, and I got to tell you, the questions that are on there are not easy. So let me go ahead and queue up this video for you. I'm going to share my screen.
But mostly what the podcast is about is it's a reason I broaden the definition of whatever I want.
You take on standardized testing. I mean, now that might sound whimsical, but it's about education, which is your passion. And you come at it from a non-American perspective. You're famously Canadian, and you have different experience.
I love that phrase. I love that phrase, famously Canadian.
Because you see, in a revisionist episode, you know, Canada is now the sort of the new sensible, or, you know, in terms of what it can tell other parts of the world, particularly your neighbor to the south. So on education and standardized questioning, what gives?
I do 2 episodes. The first 2 episodes of this season of Revisionist History concern the LSAT, but I'm really interested in, I'm using the LSAT as a kind of proxy for all standardized testing. And I have a very simple question, which is, why do they place such strict time limits on the test? What is gained by making someone hurry through those tests? Why am I more interested in the result of a standardized test where I make the student rush through all the questions than I would be in the result if I gave the student the time necessary to think deeply about how to answer them appropriately, right? So we have those tests are constructed so that you are under constant time pressure. What's the theory behind the time pressure?
And what did you find out?
Well, I went to the people who make the test, and it turned out they don't have a terribly good explanation for why they speed them up. And then I talked to people who sort of think about tests conceptually, and they said, well, when you place a time limit, a strict time limit, as we do on things like the SAT or the LSAT or the GRE or any of these tests, you change the result. So you privilege a certain kind of thinker over another kind of thinker. And it's not clear that the people that you're privileging are smarter or more capable than those who you are biasing the test against.
So that was interesting because that was something that I always had an issue with standardized tests, the fact that they were timed. You are forcing these kids to rush through these questions, and that means that if there is language on the exam that you are not familiar with, and this doesn't just apply to black kids, it also applies to kids that are English language learners. It may take them a little bit longer to read through these questions. Now, what happens is you get these scores on these exams, and depending on your score can determine whether or not, in some cases, whether or not you move on to the next grade. I think that is absolutely ridiculous. I don't think what you get on some standardized exam should determine whether or not you move on to the next grade. It should be based on your performance in the classroom. Standardized tests have done nothing for Black kids, for Latino kids, English language learner kids. They've done nothing but hold us back. And this has been a problem for a long time. I'll give you another example. Charter schools. This is a big thing now. A lot of cities are creating more and more charter schools because they feel the answer for public education is to create these schools that are test-based. You have to test into them. Some of them even have interviews. The kids have to interview at these schools in order to become admitted into those schools. Now, here's the problem with charter schools. Charter schools should not be the answer, the solution to under-resourced schools in Black communities. All my life, I have seen school boards, I have seen, districts decide not to fix the schools that are under-resourced. They have decided, instead of doing that, to create more charter schools. Depending on what state you live in, some people call them magnet schools. Pretty much the same thing. Now, here's what happens. They introduce this to those families, to those kids, that you have the option to go to this new charter school where you're going to receive top-notch education. Some of these charter schools are college prep schools, and they'll try to sell them on this idea. This is going to help you get into college, regardless of the fact that you live in such and such zip code. And that's a whole nother story about college admissions and zip codes. Here's where the huge problem comes in. You have to test into those schools. So if you are a student that has difficulty with standardized tests, you're probably going to struggle with the exam to get into those charter schools. If you do not get into the charter school, you are stuck at the under-resourced school in your neighborhood. They take the best students from your school and put them into the charter school. And the students that are underperforming are left behind. They are left to sit at that school. They are left with no resources or little resources, and they are pretty much told, deal with it. That is the problem that I have with charter schools. That should not be the answer. That should not be the solution. The solution should be to fix the schools that are underperforming, that are under-resourced in those neighborhoods, not create new schools that people have to test into. That does not help the community. Again, they are basing it on standardized tests. If you already know that Black kids are going to be more likely to struggle with standardized tests because standardized tests are biased, not because Black kids are not intelligent enough, and that is a common myth, but because standardized tests are biased. Why would you make it so that in order for them to get into the school to have a better education, they have to test in? Why? Because they don't want that many of them there to begin with. And we have several of them here in Massachusetts, especially in the Boston area, and they continue to build more and more of them. When I first moved here, when I looked at the top 10 public schools, just the public schools in the Boston area, most of the schools in the top 10 were not charter schools. They were schools in wealthy neighborhoods, though. Newton South High School, Dover Sherburne High School, Lexington High School, Concord High School, all these wealthy towns, which I expected to see them in the top 10. Now, if you pull up the list of the top 10 public schools in Massachusetts, about half of them on that list are charter schools. This is a huge problem. I want to tell you something about standardized tests that is also false. Let's talk about the SATs. Now, you do not need the SATs in order to do well in college. I'm college educated. I'm here to let you know. You don't need it. This is why some schools are choosing to make it optional, such as Temple University. Temple University now says, you know what? SAT is optional. It is what it is. More schools need to start doing that. Why do you have to take the SATs to get into college? Now, as someone who's been on the admission side of college in universities, sorry, can't talk today. It's been a crazy day. In universities, I can tell you all the SATs do is weed people out. The score that you get on your SATs does not determine how well you are going to perform in college. That is actually a myth, and I can use myself as an example. I did not do well on the SATs. I took the SATs twice. Believe it or not, I got a higher score the first time I took it than the second time I took it. Don't know what that was about. That's just savvy world. Who knows? But I didn't do well on the SATs because I bombed the math portion. Now, why did I bomb the math portion? Because I suck at math. I've told you guys multiple times, math is not my jam. Now, I was lucky enough to have tutoring when I was in high school to help me do well enough in math that I was able to at least get a B in my math classes. But the math questions on the SAT, especially the word problems, I did not perform well on. The English and the reading and written portion of the SAT, I did well on. But you have to do well on both to get a high score. That's how it was back then. I know the SATs have changed now. But that being said, I didn't perform well in the SATs. Got into college. Guys, I graduated undergrad with a 3.7 GPA. I knew people that got a 1600 on the SAT. At that time, that was the highest you could get. They didn't get a 3.7 GPA in college. I knew people that got a 1600 on the SAT that flunked out their freshman year. Nothing that I learned on the SAT helped me do well in college. Do you think I was remembering these passages they had me read from the SAT? And I'm like, oh, I'm sitting in English class and think to myself, oh, what about that passage that I read on the SAT? How could that help me right now? Nope. Nada. Not even happening. They are used to weed out applicants. And let me tell you how they do it. When you apply to universities, the first thing that is examined are your test scores. Yes, your GPA is looked at also, but the first thing, this is the first eliminator. I've been on admissions committees. The first eliminator is your SAT score or your ACT score. So if you don't meet the threshold that the admissions committee is looking for on the SAT or the ACT, boom, let's go ahead and remove those applicants. This is how they cut down the number of applicants. So that within itself eliminates a lot of people. You'd be surprised. People who probably could have done really well had they been given the opportunity. The second thing that they'll look at is your GPA. That also eliminates some people, but most of it is those test scores, I'm telling you. Then they'll go from there, and then they'll look at other things. Let's look and see if they had extracurricular activities. Let's see if they had a job while they were in high school, because that's a good thing to have, like on your college application. Let's look and see if they did any type of community service. Now, here's the problem. In my opinion, those things should be looked at first, not the score you received on an exam. Because to me, I would rather admit a student that has been more productive in their community, that has been more productive in society, than a student that just got a really crazy high score and has done nothing outside of the classroom. But that's just me. But these exams, forget it. They do not determine how well you are going to perform. If that was the case, I would have not been sitting there with a 3.7 GPA. I would have not gone to grad school. I got almost a 4.0 in grad school. Those exams mean zip. So if they know that Black kids are more likely to underperform on standardized tests, and they know that that is the first eliminator they are going to look at when you apply to college, then they also know that they are not going to admit many Black students. It is a way to keep Black people down. It is a way to prevent you from getting some of the same opportunities as your white peers. Now, they'll never tell you that. But being on those committees, I know that. All they need is that one. They only need that one Black student, and they can say they have diversity. I want to show you another video, and then I'm going to go to some of the comments in the chat. There's another video. Let me pull this up. And this one was on CNN. So this is from a couple of years ago. And now I want you to remember everything I just told you, because the guy that they interview on CNN, he's going to try to say the exact opposite of what I just showed you, but they're going to call him. Whoops, sorry. They're going to call him out on it. So here we go. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Mute my mic.
I want to start really at the beginning.
Mhm.
Is the SAT biased?
In some technical sense, it's probably not a biased test. The problems become in how it gets used in the admissions process.
Fair Test is dedicated to ensuring fairness in standardized testing.
The purpose of the SAT, why it got constructed, was to predict college grades. So what happens is that kids of color, Black kids, Hispanic kids, are very often left out. They're going to be predicted to not do well, when in fact they could do well.
So what Fair Test is saying essentially is if a college is using the SAT as a primary indicator, the test is not telling them the truth?
Most colleges will use the SAT as one piece of evidence, but a lot of them will use it to weed out a whole lot of kids who never then get a chance.
What's your alternative?
We have a list of 830 colleges for whom the test is optional for some or all of their applicants. And what's been found out is that those colleges, they get a more diverse student body, the grade point average stays the same, and they graduate at the same rate.
Lawrence Bunin from the College Board, the owners of the SAT, disagrees.
Fairtest is mistaken on this point. The research is very clear, and there's many studies that the SAT is absolutely predictive of how well students will do in college, as well as whether they'll stay in college. Every single question on the SAT is tested with real students from all races and all walks of life to ensure that every question on the SAT is fair.
So there is no group that generally outperforms all other groups.
There is an achievement gap in this country, not just on any one test.
So the country's bad and the test isn't.
Well, the test is a fair test that helps mirror what's going on in the country, and it's excellent that we have it so that we have a fair indicator of college readiness preparation in math and English. Students and parents should understand that colleges look at a variety of factors, not just a test.
As someone who sends children to college, I can assure you that colleges, especially the most elite, lean heavily upon the SAT still. So why do we need the SAT?
Well, that's a great question. Imagine the world without the SAT.
I can.
I would think that parents would be glad to know that there is a fair national test of math and English so that college admissions are not so subjective.
Yeah, that may be one thing you and I'd leave disagreeing.
It's interesting that even when income levels and education levels of the parents are the same, that you still have these disparities in SAT scores.
Exactly. No matter what the College Board says, the facts are the facts. Facts are that still students of color perform lower, and African Americans and Latinos perform lower on the SAT. So one of the things that needs to happen to be able to increase the probability that a child will go into college, regardless of their socioeconomic background as well as their ethnic background, is to make the SAT less important to the application process.
Principal Perry, thanks.
Thank you.
I think we're unique because now, as you can see.
Okay. So again, the guy that he interviewed at the end, that was BS. Notice how when he was asking him about the achievement gap, he was trying to tell him that there is a gap between like Black students and white students in education. There's a gap between that. He responds to it as, well, there are, gaps, there's achievement gaps, but he wouldn't admit that the gap was racial. He wouldn't admit that. And it is. You don't need the SATs to do well in college. You don't need to perform well on the SATs to do well in college. Nothing on that exam had anything to do with my classes or my performance. Nothing. And the gentleman who interviewed him from CNN, I don't think they said his name, but the gentleman who interviewed him, who was saying towards the end, he said, even in situations where a Black student came from the same amount of wealth as their white counterpart, there was still a gap. Maybe not as significant, but there was still a gap. And there is a reason for that. And what I'm trying to tell you is because the questions that they have on those tests, the way that they are worded, the way they ask the question, what the questions are about, the multiple choice answers, the options that they give you to choose from, the fact that these exams are timed. These exams were never written by Black people. They're not written by us. So they're not going to reflect a culture that we are most familiar with. That is why. It has nothing to do with the fact that one race is inherently born more intelligent than the other. It has nothing to do with that. That is not the reason. These tests are written by Eurocentric people, Eurocentric culture. So that is what is going to be displayed on the test. Shout out to Delthea Simmons for the super chat. We don't need more or better standardized tests. We need more classrooms, instructors, and support staff and services. 100%. Thanks so much, Delthea, for the super chat. This is a problem. If you were to go, and I've been in these schools, so I've seen it. If you were to go to an inner city school in Baltimore, then you drive just about 20 minutes away to a public school in Towson, Maryland, which is right above Baltimore, suburban area. And if you were to evaluate the classroom environment in both of those situations, 9 times out of 10, the teacher teaching in the inner city school has more students in her classroom, and the teacher teaching in the suburban school, where people are a little bit more well off financially, has less students in her classroom. When you have more students in the classroom, this means you cannot give as much individual attention to each student. You may not be able to come around to every student in the classroom that has a question. And then those students are left to struggle. Don't believe me? Come here to Massachusetts. There are towns here, like I've talked to people here, they'll tell you, like, growing up here, depending on which town they lived in, if they lived in a wealthy town, where they only had like 10, 15 people in the class. So if you have a smaller class size and you're getting more individual attention from your teacher has more time to answer your questions and work with you one-on-one. You're probably not going to need as much help from mom and dad to do your homework when you go home. Don't Tell the House Slave said, isn't it weird how rich suburban school has kick-ass arts and is that? Did you mean music? Arts and music? I think it's music. They have the money to do it. They have the money. They have the funding. They can do it. When they start to cut back from schools, especially schools that are under-resourced, the first place they cut is arts and music. And that's unfortunate. Greg Bruce says IQ tests are also Eurocentric. Exactly. You guys have to look at these questions. I remember there was a word problem when I was growing up back in the day. It still bothers me till this day. Never really got around it, you know? And the word problem was about 2 trains. 2 trains leave from the station. Train leaves from station A at this time. Train leaves from station B at this time. What time would the trains meet at such and such station? And I remember, like, as a kid thinking to myself, and yes, I thought this way even as a kid. I thought, how the hell would I know? I'm not on the damn train. I never really understood the point of that question. And so because I didn't understand why they were asking the question, and I couldn't really see myself in that situation, I like to picture myself in these situations, whether it's word problems, whether it's English. If I can't picture myself in it, if I can't picture it as part of my environment, it takes me longer to answer the question. It takes me longer to figure it out. But I never understood the point of that. I still remember that word problem till this day. Whipple Dingle Weedle Puffin said, once upon a time, parents had enough hours in the day to help their kids with their homework. Once upon a time. Not so much like that today. Phenomenal Mysticism says, Sabby, what do you think about the MCAS? So the MCAS are standardized tests here in Massachusetts. I don't know if they're still allowing this benefit to happen, but it used to be, depending on what score you received on the MCAS, you could go to any state college in Massachusetts for free. Sounds like a pretty sweet deal, right? But how many Black kids in those classrooms got that score to get that benefit? How many Black kids that went to under-resourced schools in Roxbury, Mattapan, Dorchester, Chelsea, Revere, how many of them made it to that score so that they could go to a state school for free? And you know what sucks? The ones who really needed that free education, most of the time, don't get it because they don't get the score. That's my opinion on the MCAS. I think standardized tests are a waste of time. I think it's just a way to weed people out. I don't think that you need them. Shout out to John Kemper for the super chat. We need our own lefty land with our own lefty teachers. This system is not for us. I'll put my funds into such a project. Oh, John, now you're talking solutions. You know, I like solutions. That is a very good point. Look, the education system that we have in this country is not working out. It's just not. Socialist Alternative says, Sabby Sabs, do you think the problem with standardized testing has more to do with class or race? That is a really good question. I think it's both. Because the fact is, let's talk about the class portion. If you are coming from a lower income community, right? 9 times out of 10, your schools are going to be underfunded because public schools are funded based on property taxes. That in itself is BS. That should have never happened in this country. That's one problem. So if you are lower income, you're probably most likely going to go to a under-resourced school. Under-resourced doesn't necessarily mean that the school is poor, that the building is falling apart. But what it does mean is that that school does not have all the resources that it needs to have for those students to be successful, to get the education that they need, to get the scores that they need, going back to standardized tests, to get into those colleges. So that's the class part of it. The racial part of it, though, is that you have to go back to white flight. When white people moved out of the cities and moved into the suburbs, and when Black people who could afford to do so at that time were told, no, you can't come here. You can't buy houses here. Cory Booker went through that. He laid out that whole story about how his parents had to get their white friend to buy a house for them, even though it was for them, because the realtor wouldn't let Black people buy a house in the neighborhood. So when white people moved out of the cities, they took the money with them. So that means that the schools that were left in the cities were underfunded because of property taxes. So that being said, who usually lives in those neighborhoods? And this is not to say that Black people don't live in suburban areas. We do, but not at the same portion that white people do. And this is just a fact. If I go back to Maryland, where my family's from, I go through Baltimore, there's a big difference when I go from Baltimore County and I drive to Baltimore City. Baltimore City is predominantly Black. And the schools are underfunded and they're under-resourced and they're terrible. And I know because I went to Baltimore City schools at one point in my life while we were waiting for my dad to get like his next assignment. So I went to elementary school and I came from Germany. So I immediately on day one, I saw the difference. I knew something wasn't right. So that's the racial part of it. This is more likely going to affect Black kids. and Latino kids, but predominantly is going to affect Black kids. Now, going back to the class portion, what did the guy on CNN, what did he just tell you? That studies have even shown that even when you had a Black student and a white student, and they were coming from the same amount of wealth, so they were coming from maybe not a wealthy neighborhood, but they were coming from higher income area, suburban area. Even in those examples, there was still achievement gaps on those exams. So that tells me it's not primarily based on class. That's a part of it, but it's predominantly based on race. And we got to call it out for what it is. Again, I go back to those questions that are in the chat, those questions that are on the exam. How I couldn't relate to some of those questions. You got to take the time. You got 30 minutes to finish this portion of the exam. Everybody, 1, 2, 3, go, start. First question you go to, you're like, first of all, you got to figure out, what are they even talking about? I don't know, because I can't relate to it. If Johnny has 5 apples in his hands and 4 lemons in his other hand and such on his head, and he meets up with his friend Chris, and they do that. First of all, who the hell is Johnny and Chris? And why is John walking around with 5 apples in his hand? This is the way that I would think, because I couldn't relate to it. These are the things that we really have to think about. Shout out to Stephanie for the super chat. Also a problem with standardized testing, kids with learning disabilities. I jammed in school, tanked my SATs, ADHD. They're supposed to offer replacements for that. They're supposed to accommodate those students. Now, I haven't talked to students that have had learning disabilities. From what I've heard, the accommodations are not that great. They're supposed to give them more time to take those exams now. This is how it's supposed to go today. Doesn't always work out that way, though. And to be honest with you, I can tell you with colleges, students that have put in those accommodation requests, sometimes by the time the Disability Service Office answers their request, they've already finished the fall semester. The backlog of paperwork. Meanwhile, that kid still has to take their tests or they're going to fail the class. It's very unfortunate. But this is the reality, and this is the world that we live in today, and we need to call it out for what it is. Now, some people will say, why is it that some international students perform so much better on standardized tests? I can tell you, having lived abroad, the school systems in Europe are very different from what we have here in the United States. Very different. And some countries have it where students are going to school 6 days a week, not 5 days a week. Some countries, or some towns and stuff like in Europe and other countries as well, they will focus on subject areas that they know there are job demands for more. So those students may be required to take more math and science courses. For example, in high school, I didn't have to take calculus. If you go to some of the other countries, that may not be the case. That may be required. So if you have more years of studying math and science and you're required to take those advanced courses, sure, you're probably going to do really well on the GMAT. It's not even required. We have schools here in the United States that don't even require students to learn a foreign language. You guys ever notice that? One of the things I noticed when I lived in Europe, almost every European that I met spoke more than one language. I went up to Montreal with my husband. I've gone up there a couple times, actually, to be honest. But went up to Montreal. It's not a long drive from here. And we were at a game, and I remember the girl in front of us who was from Montreal. She said that in Montreal, they're required to learn both English and French. It's required. It's not an option. We are one of the most uneducated countries. Yeah, we have like these Ivy League schools. We have the Harvard and the Yales and the Princetons. But as a whole, nah. Mr. Piece of Work said, when I was in community college in one place, it was in the 90s, but another place, it wasn't. I'm not sure what you mean. Shout out to Blue Moon Red Wine. Greetings. Everybody say hey to Lucy. Definitely check out Lucy's channel. She's really awesome. Lucy said, I wonder if it's just if you're from a rote learning culture versus oral learning. That's a good question. I mean, like my dad was stationed in Korea, and like he can tell you, like in Korea, I'm just telling you, when you compare us to some of these other countries, they are far more advanced than we are. Go to Japan. You think we have technology here? Ha! Ha! Live show video says solution, abolish capitalism. So as you heard Jamal Bowman say in the first video clip, and again, I'm not trying to promote Jamal Bowman here, okay? Just want to make that very clear, but he was an educator beforehand. What you heard him say in that video, this is a money-making scheme. All of these test prep companies, they make a lot of money off of this stuff. It's a money-making scheme. So live show videos is right. At the end of the day, it does go back to capitalism. Why can't we have the same schools for everybody? Why should you have to suffer because you were born poor? That's really a slap in the face if you think about it. So you mean to tell me because a kid is born poor, they don't deserve the right to have a good, decent education? That's really screwed up. Welcome to America. Laura Hansen said in Thailand, it's not a crime to be poor. They have healthcare and value education. Only in America, I'm telling you, it's this country. It is this country. They don't want everyone to have the same level of education. If they have same level of, if all of us had the same level of education, great quality education, then all of us could apply to college and all of us could get into those colleges. But then that would mean that some of us who are of a darker shade would have the opportunity to be on a level playing field. Can't have that. Education holds a lot of people back. Education. Let's remember, when slaves first came to this country, what did they tell them they could not do? They were not allowed to learn to read. They were not allowed to learn to write. Patrick B said, the more they reject, the more elite they are. There you go. And Wong Hung Lo, I'm going to block you. Got rid of the troll. Jean said, here in Costa Rica, they teach civics as young as kindergarten and move into civil law and labor laws. Yeah, I mean, there was something that I did notice when I came back from Germany and I came back to the States. The first school that I started at when I came back here, we were in North Carolina. This was really weird. Like, I remember they were just starting to teach algebra 2, and we had already did that the year before. It is what it is, man. But this is the problem with the education system in this country. Standardized tests, what I want you guys to walk away with is standardized tests don't determine whether or not you are going to succeed in college. I'm living proof of that, and I know other people who are living proof of that. Standardized tests do not determine necessarily how intelligent you are. There are different types of intelligence. Different types of intelligence. So if standardized tests don't really determine how well you're going to do in college, if they don't really determine just how intelligent you are, do we really need standardized tests? I don't think we do. All right, guys, I am coming up on my time. So we have a couple cool things happening later on tonight. I have to eat dinner and then I got to get ready for my other stream. But join me over on my channel on Sabby Sabs at 7:30. I'm going to talk about Clarence Thomas and his ridiculous statement about the Supreme Court recently. We're going to talk about Ric Flair, who is under fire, apparently. And we're going to talk about the veteran that was kicked off of Newsmax. That was an interesting show. So I'm going to talk about that tonight at 7:30. And then after my stream, there is going to be a special FHL stream tonight. It is our 10K celebration. So you get to see us all night. You get to see us all night. All right, guys, it's 7 o'clock. I got to head out. If you want to see me later, check me out at 7:30. Sabby Sabs.